So the recent Netflix series American Primeval paints Brigham Young out to be a villain of the deepest evil. And this actually is nothing new. There is a long tradition of painting Brigham Young as a monster. Now, Brigham certainly had some rough edges, and in an almost Donald Trump-like fashion, he said things that we all wish that he didn't say. But serious biographers of Brigham Young, including non-Mormons like John Turner, paint a very different picture of Brigham. Brigham was a complex man, to be sure, but he was also a man in a very complicated set of circumstances, and most people who hate Brigham Young could not even give you a basic sketch of his life and the circumstances that he was faced with. In the future, I hope to make a series telling his incredible story. But in this video, I will just tell you a few things about him that the popular press and even ignorant members never mention. A popular trope is that Brigham Young wanted to exterminate the Native Americans in Utah. This is because the following letter was sent by Governor Young in 1850 to the territorial military after a series of skirmishes with local Indians.
You are hereby ordered to race forth with a company of 50 efficient men, and to cooperate with the inhabitants of said valley in quelling and staying the operations of all hostile Indians, and otherwise act, as the circumstances may require, exterminating such as do not separate themselves from their hostile clans and sue for peace.
Now, obviously, this order was not calling for the genocide of all Native Americans. It focused on hostile Indians specifically.
While some of Young's decisions had tragic consequences, he was not an exterminator. Indeed, when he received word of the first deaths, Young discouraged hasty and broad retribution.
While we consider such outrages altogether unbearable, and we will not submit to them, we have no desire to inflict indiscriminate punishment upon both the innocent and the guilty.
Historians who study the settling of the American West, actually nearly universally, recognize that Brigham was strangely empathetic toward natives when compared to others of that time.
Young showed unusual empathy for the Indians' plight. While he insisted that the saints were not interlopers because God had brought them to the Great Basin, both peoples possessed the land, and the saints had to provide for the Indians, whose sustenance they had imperiled. Indeed, few political leaders in the American West would have called for restraint and coexistence under similar circumstances.
And how about the native chiefs? What did they think of Brigham?
The chiefs in attendance expressed due respect for Young. "Brigham is the great captain of all," stated the Pavant chief Kanash, "for he does not get mad when he hears of his brothers and friends as the California captains do." Kanash praised Young's straight talk and accused past federal Indian agents of employing two tongues.
Periodically, Brigham sent letters and presents, cattle, clothing, guns, grain, tobacco, to the chief Walkara, who they called Walker, and responses became more and more respectful. By the time of Walker's death, early in 1855, he was willing to say that Brigham really had been his best friend. Brigham's language in these diplomatic exchanges is illustrated in his letter written less than a month before the chief's death.
Brother Walker, you have never known me to be aught but your steadfast, undeviating friend. No two faces, nor double meaning have I ever shown you, and I never shall. But you know some of your people are not wise in their actions, neither are some of mine, and we must mutually forgive. I now send you 6 large plugs of tobacco, that you may smoke in peace with your friends, remembering that I am one friend, whilst ever you sojourn upon the earth, earnestly seeking your true welfare.
And keep in mind, Brigham was dealing with a very complex set of potentially violent situations with the Native Americans. For example, Daniel W. Jones recounted the following.
The Utes were in the habit of raiding on the Paiutes and Low tribes, taking their children prisoners and selling them. Next year, when they came up and camped on the Provo bench, they had some Indian children for sale. They offered them to the Mormons, who declined buying. Arapine, Walker's brother, became enraged, saying that the Mormons had stopped the Mexicans from buying these children, that they had no right to do so unless they bought them themselves. Several of us were present when he took one of these children by the heels and dashed its brains out on the hard ground, after which he threw the body towards us, telling us we had no hearts, or we would have bought it and saved its life.
So how did Brigham react when he found out that the natives would kill the children that they could not sell?
Brigham found that the Indians resented his interference with their trade and then looked to the Mormons to pay for the children. So Brigham advised his people to buy up the Lamanite children as fast as they could and educate them and teach them the gospel, and said that the Lord could not have devised a better plan than to have put us where we were in order to accomplish that thing.
What many people don't realize is that one of the main reasons that slavery was legalized in Utah was so that Mormons could purchase native children in order to save their lives. Brigham was literally fighting child sex slavery in the 1850s. Also, how many white settlers of the time would have said something like this while in the midst of attacks during the Black Hawk War of the 1860s?
Young rebuked the residents of Springville for their actions and attitudes toward the Indians. He threatened that settlers who killed innocent Indians would have to pay with their own blood in order to maintain their eternal salvation. He also warned that those who feel as though they should wipe out the Lamanites needed to repent.
So what else do people get wrong about Brigham? Well, how about the claim that he was an uncaring and unfeeling man? Perhaps we should consider what B.F. Grant said about him. He was the son of Brigham's former counselor.
B.F., for Brigham Frederick Grant, was the son of Brigham's counselor Jedediah Grant. He was only a few weeks old when his father died in 1856. In 1868, at the age of 12, he ran away with a freight train headed for the Montana mines and remained there for 2 years. Learning that he was Jedediah Grant's son, a Mormon freighter invited him to return with him to Salt Lake City, where he went to work in a coal yard. Somebody informed Brigham of his presence in the city, and Brigham sent word that he wanted to see him. The president greeted B.F. with a father's handshake and learned what he had been doing. When Brigham offered him easier work, a job in one of his stores, B.F. replied, "I haven't got sense enough to work in a store. I can't read or write." Tears rolled down Brigham's cheeks, wrote B.F. as he remembered the interview. He took out his handkerchief, wiped them off, and said, "My boy, come and live with me. I will give you a home, clothe you, and send you to school. You can work during the vacation for me." B.F. accepted the offer and remained with Brigham's family for 2 years. He reported that there were 6 other orphaned boys and girls living in the family at that time, and he, for one, was a real member of the family. Ultimately, however, B.F. decided he wanted to go to California, where some friends of his were making big money. Brigham tried to dissuade him, told him it was a mistake to leave school and the home he had provided. When Brigham saw that B.F. was determined, Brigham fitted him out with a trunk full of clothing and other necessaries. There was a tearful session in the family evening prayer service, and a subsequent meeting alone with Brigham the next morning when Brigham gave B.F. a $100 greenback and some fatherly advice. In writing of the episode, B.F. said that Brigham had 2 outstanding characteristics. On the one hand, he was very stern and had a positive way of saying and doing things. On the other hand, he had a kind and loving way that was like a loving mother for her child. With his spirit of discernment, he was able to decide which of these attitudes was appropriate so that justice and right should prevail.
But surely Brigham didn't show this kind of kindness towards women, right? Well, maybe you should consider the story of Brigham's first wife, Miriam, and what he did during her long-term illness.
Miriam contracted chronic tuberculosis. The illness of Brigham's mother was now repeated in his own household. His work often had to be on a part-time basis, for he had to get breakfast for himself, Miriam, and the girls, dress the children, clean up the house, and carry Miriam to the rocking chair by the fireplace before he could leave. When he returned, he cooked the evening meal, cleaned up, read to Miriam from the Bible, and carried her back to bed. A Canandaigua resident later recalled in a letter to the Ontario Republican Times, "There could scarcely be a more kind and affectionate husband and father than Brigham was, and few men in his circumstances would have provided better for their families. Mrs. Young was sick, most of the time unable to do any kind of work. She was well deserving his care and attention, and she had it."
Or how about the story of Ellis Reynolds?
Ellis Reynolds was the oldest of 4 children born in a farming family in Pleasant Grove, Utah. She was 14 when her mother died, and she had to become the homemaker. Within a year, however, her father remarried. She was discontented there and made occasional visits to Salt Lake City to attend musical and dramatic performances, general conference, and to visit family friends and relatives. Ellis was warmly received by the Young family. Brigham was impressed with her vivacity and intelligence. The next day he sent her an invitation to come live in the Beehive House and attend school with his own children. She knelt with the Young family in prayers, sat in one of their boxes at the theater, and was privately tutored in the Beehive House. After 2 years, she married Milford Shipp and moved into her own home. Determined to keep up her learning, however, she arose at 4 each morning and studied for 3 hours before her household began to stir. When she was 28, with 3 children, she obtained the support of Brigham, her husband, and others, and went to Philadelphia to earn a degree at the Women's Medical College. Upon her return to Utah, she specialized in obstetrics, diseases of women, and minor surgery. She was active in women's organizations of the church, a delegate to the National Council of Women, had additional children, and lived to be 92. To a whole generation of young women, she was living proof that Brigham really meant it when he declared,
"We believe that women are useful not only to sweep houses, wash dishes, make beds, and raise babies, but that they should stand behind the counter, study law or physics, medicine, or become good bookkeepers and be able to do the business in any counting house. And all this to enlarge their sphere of usefulness for the benefit of society at large. In these things, they but answer the design of their creation."
In a fascinating departure from the culture of his era, Brigham believed firmly in the education of both men and women, and nearly immediately went about setting up what have become world-class universities in Utah.
A fourth legacy of Brigham's to his people was a mindset that held Mormonism to be synonymous with truth, incorporating scientific and philosophical as well as doctrinal truth. As far as he was concerned, anything that was true had to be part of Mormonism.
Were you to ask me how it was that I embraced Mormonism, I should answer, for the simple reason that it embraces all truth in heaven and on earth, in the earth, under the earth, and in hell, if there be any truth there. Not only does the religion of Jesus Christ make people acquainted with the things of God, but it holds out every encouragement and inducement possible for them to increase in knowledge and intelligence in every branch of engineering or in the arts and sciences, for all wisdom and all the arts and sciences in the world are from God and are designed for the good of his people.
This concept, first expressed by Joseph Smith but consolidated into Mormon doctrine by Young, rejected a narrow sectarianism, encouraged Mormons to seek higher education in Eastern colleges and universities, and ultimately led to the flowering of church-supported higher education in Utah.
And for those who think Brigham was somehow departing from Joseph Smith, I will let the scholar Daniel Peterson explain.
Joseph Smith, his dedication to following Joseph Smith was amazing, and that's the thing that I want to get across, among other things, his faithfulness to Joseph. Here's a quotation from a book by S. Dilworth Young, his descendant. Here is Brigham, 1964. "It's quite evident that after 1832, Brigham Young was moved by one motive: determination to obey the will of God as spoken through the prophet, and to support that prophet with all that he possessed of time, talent, and means." Now, there's one famous story of a time when the prophet Joseph Smith severely rebuked Brigham Young, the Lion of the Lord, you may remember he was sometimes called. This is a man who did not meekly submit to other people. After the prophet's chastisement, everyone in the room waited for Brigham's response. He could have defended himself or been offended, but his reply was sincerely and simply, "Joseph, what do you want me to do?" That was one man that he would bend the knee to. Again, quoting Irving Stone, "Men to match my mountains." Following Joseph Smith's original design, Young, the city planner in Salt Lake, decreed that the streets were to be laid out enormously wide, each house set back so many feet, the fronts to be beautified with fruit trees and gardens, and 4 public squares of 10 acres laid out in various parts of the city for public grounds. Salt Lake City is a monument to Brigham's devotion to the vision of Joseph Smith. And now, I give you an excerpt from a dream that Brigham related to the Quorum of the 12 on the 17th of February, 1847, as recorded in his own handwriting and his own inimitable spelling. "I took him," he sees Joseph Smith in a dream, "I took him by the right hand and kissed him many times. He looked perfectly natural. I asked him why it was that we could not be together as we used to live. He had been from us a long time, and we wanted his society, and I do not like to be separated from him. He rose up from his chair, looked at me with an earnest and pleasant countenance, spoke in his usual way. "It is all right." I then said to him, "I do not like to be away from you." "It is right," he replied. "We cannot be together yet. We shall be by and by. But you will have to do without me a while, and then we shall be together again." The love for Joseph that you see throughout Brigham's life. And on the 29th of August, 1877, when Brigham Young lay on his deathbed, at least one report says that his last words were, "Joseph, Joseph, Joseph." I can't help but think that Joseph came for him. And the reunion that he'd waited for over 30 years was finally taking place.
It should also be noted that recent research by the historian Legine Carruth suggests that many things purportedly said by Brigham may not have actually been said by him at all, and may give us an inaccurate portrait of the man.
I am a professional transcriber of 19th and early 20th century documents written in Pittman and Taylor shorthands at the Church History Library, Salt Lake City. I have spent much of my career transcribing the words of Brigham Young. Last year at Fair, I presented how the words spoken by Brigham Young and others were often significantly altered in transcription and editing. The versions of these words that were published in the Journal of Discourses, the Deseret News, and Lineal Star often differ significantly from what was really said. These changes incorrectly warp readers' opinions of Brigham Young and others. Brigham Young, as he really spoke, was a much more powerful speaker and a much kinder, more understanding and thoughtful man than he has come to be seen through sermons which have been altered, edited, and changed in many ways. In addition to these changes, many of the sermons spoken by Brigham Young and others were reported in Pittman's shorthand but never transcribed until I transcribed them, most over 150 years after they were spoken and recorded. These previously untranscribed sermons by Brigham Young include many statements that he made about himself, his life, his conversion, and his faith. On October 6, 1867, the saints met in the Salt Lake City Tabernacle for the first time, our current tabernacle. Brigham Young rose, made some remarks about the still unfinished state of the organ, and then dedicated the tabernacle to the Lord. This dedicatory prayer was completely unknown until I found the original shorthand record of it several years ago and transcribed it. Prior to that time, the earliest known dedication of the tabernacle was 1875. I will read the very start of his dedicatory prayer. The entire prayer is available online at history.churchofjesuschrist.org. Quote, "O God, our Heavenly Father, who dwells in the heavens, in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ, we come before thee at this time to worship thee. On this occasion, we ask for the aid of thy Holy Spirit to teach us how to pray, what we should ask for, and how to ask that we may receive." End quote. This and other prayers by Brigham Young tell us a lot about the man. In prayer, the line of the Lord was a humble, pleading servant. Brigham Young grew up in a very strict, very poor home. Quote, "After I was 23 years old, I had 11 days of education. I was brought up in the woods. My father wanted to be wealthy and was plowing the new countries to make himself wealth. My father never bought me but one hat from the world, and it cost him $1. I do not think my father ever furnished me more than 2 or 3 pair of shoes in his life." End quote. At that time, children, or the labor of children, belonged to the parents until they were 21 years old. Brigham Young's father told him when he was 16 that he could have his time, that is, he could leave and support himself, which he did from that age on, learning many things in the process. Quote, "I went to school 11 days, the most school I ever had. But from that time I was 16 years old, I clothed and fed myself. I have been in the School of Economy since I was 16. End quote.
Now, if you're starting to feel like maybe you have been given a false understanding of Brigham Young through popular media, you would not be alone. President Ulysses S. Grant and his wife felt very similar.
President Grant visited Salt Lake City, and Brigham arranged a meeting with him. As Brigham was introduced, he removed his hat, as did the president, and said, "President Grant, this is the first time I have ever seen a president of my country." Grant nodded and introduced Brigham to Mrs. Grant, and they spent a half hour in pleasant conversation. Grant's arrival was on Sunday, and as he was carried up South Temple Street from the depot to Temple Square, several thousand Sunday school children were on each side of the street to give the presidential party a hearty greeting. The president inquired of his escort whose children they were. He replied, "Mormon children." For several moments the president was silent, wrote Edward Tullidge. Then he murmured, in a tone of self-reproach, "I have been deceived." Tullidge also wrote that Mrs. Grant attended an organ recital in the tabernacle and was much moved by what she saw and heard. She is reported to have said, "Oh, I wish I could do something for these good Mormon people."
I can't tell you how many times in my life I have seen people have experiences like these when they have actually gone beyond the popular tropes about Latter-day Saints and actually got to know us. We are not a perfect people, and Brigham Young was not a perfect man. And sure, you can quote mine and find that in many respects, he was a man of his time with all the flaws familiar to any man. But when you step back and look at his whole story, something incredible emerges. The things he did are incredible. When he took over, Joseph was dead and the flock was about to scatter. Through the sheer force of his will and testimony, he saved the church. He led an exodus of tens of thousands of people into the wilds of the West and not only held them together, but took their message to the world and brought to the Intermountain West people from all around the world, thus creating the home of the Latter-day Saint people to this day. And he was not just the president of the church, he was a governor, a superintendent of Indian affairs, a settler, a theologian, a philanthropist, a builder, and an entrepreneur. Do you really think that Sidney Rigdon or James Strang or someone else could have done what he did? He was unique. He was a unique man for a unique time. I genuinely have a testimony of the church largely because I can't help but think that God's hand was in some way guiding this passionate and bold man named Brigham Young. Jedediah Grant was a counselor to Brigham Young, and he knew that people back east, and perhaps people of our day, would not understand what life was like in the Wild West, or why Brigham was so uniquely suited to that time. So he wrote the following to an East Coast newspaper that I think summarizes Brigham Young quite well. I can't undertake to explain Brigham Young to your Atlantic citizens, or expect you to put him in his value. Your great men eastward are to me like your ivory and pearl-handled table knives, balanced handles, more shiny than the inside of my watch case, but with only edge enough to slice bread and cheese, and all alike, one with another. Brigham is the article that sells out west with us, between a Roman cutlass and a beef butcher knife, the thing to cut up a deer or to cut down an enemy, and that will save your life or carve your dinner every bit as well, though the handpiece is a buckhorn and the case a hogskin. You that judge men by the handle and sheath, how can I make you know a good blade? Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button so my future videos show up on your feed. Also, if you or someone that you know has benefited from the content here on Thoughtful Faith, please consider becoming a channel donor or volunteer by visiting my new website, thoughtfulfaith.org, and clicking on the Get Involved page.